photo gate from Mom's 70th.
It was really innocent, which some years now, and they have a really
call her Meghan Markle instead of.
For weeks now, public attention surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry has followed a familiar rhythm. A brief surge of discussion erupts. Online reactions spike, headlines multiply, and then, almost as quickly, focus shifts elsewhere. On the surface, this cycle looks like controversy, fatigue, but beneath it, a more revealing narrative has been quietly forming, one rooted not in outrage, but in optics, attention, economics, and the subtle mechanics of modern relevance. The latest moment that reignited conversation did not involve a major announcement or a formal appearance. Instead, it centered on a series of photographs taken during a high-profile social gathering attended by well-known public figures. At first glance, the images appeared unremarkable, a social setting, familiar faces, a snapshot of public life continuing as usual. Yet within hours, what seemed trivial evolved into a broader discussion about symbolism, timing, and perception. Those close to the situation explained that the images were taken without controversy, shared with consent, and later removed out of respect for Remembrance Day. The clarification emphasized courtesy and sensitivity, presenting the episode as a misunderstanding rather than an intentional oversight. On paper, the explanation was straightforward, but the public reaction suggested that something else was at play. The conversation was never really about the photographs themselves, that it was about optics. In public life, especially at the intersection of celebrity and symbolism, perception often carries as much weight as intention. Appearances are interpreted not only by what they show, but by when they occur. Certain dates, particularly those associated with national remembrance or collective reflection, heighten sensitivity. For Prince Harry, who has frequently spoken about service, sacrifice, and respect for the armed force, the timing of a visible social appearance on such a day was bound to invite scrutiny. Regardless of intent, what complicated matters further was not the initial choice, but the response that followed. Instead of allowing the moment to quietly pass, the explanation itself became amplified. Similar statements appeared across multiple outlets, repeating the same clarifications in slightly varied forms. Rather than resolving the issue, the repetition extended its lifespan. What might have remained a minor footnote became a sustained talking point. Not because of outrage, but because of saturation. In today's media environment, repetition can be counterproductive. When explanations feel overly managed, audiences begin to question not just the decision being explained, but the strategy behind the explanation itself. At that point, messaging becomes part of the scrutiny. This dynamic is not isolated. It reflects a broader pattern that has followed the Duke and Duchess of Sussex in recent years. Public engagement around their projects increasingly centers less on the substance of the work and more on how it is framed. The story rarely stands alone. It is accompanied by layers of interpretation, clarification, and narrative guidance. For many observers, this produces fatigue. As this conversation unfolded, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry were also appearing at the Sundance Film Festival, supporting a documentary focused on youth, entrepreneurship, and ambition. The appearance was cordial, polished, and professional. Yet industry watchers noted something telling. The response was muted. The screening did not ignite the kind of organic momentum typically associated with festival standouts. Coverage was respectful, but restrained. Reviews were balanced, but lacked urgency. There was no wave of secondary discussion pushing the project into broader cultural conversation. In entertainment, silence often communicates more than criticism. Failure is not always dramatic. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through absence rather than backlash. Projects that resonate are defended instinctively. They spark debate, reinterpretation, and enthusiasm. Projects that do not tend to drift gently out of focus, without confrontation. This pattern has become increasingly visible in how recent ventures associated with the Sussexes are received. Attention does not collapse, it thins. Interest does not turn openly hostile. It simply disperses. This distinction matters because relevance in the digital age depends on sustained engagement. Controversy, even negative, can be left. Outrage can be redirected. Indifference cannot. As focus lingered on optics and perception, another layer of the narrative resurfaced through reflections about past relationships tied to the royal wedding. A former family connection offered measured commentary on the ceremony, describing it as a moment of spectacle that, while meaningful at the time, no longer plays an active role in everyday life. The comments were careful and there were no accusations, no emotional appeals. Yet, even in their restraint, they underscored a recurring theme: distance. Many figures who once featured prominently during the wedding period have gradually faded from public association with the couple. This is not unusual in celebrity culture, but when observed alongside other developments, it reinforces a broader perception that periods of intense visibility are often followed by quiet separation. Again, this is not an allegation. It is pattern recognition. Public perception is rarely shaped by single events. It forms through accumulation. When similar dynamics repeat, high visibility followed by withdrawal, explanation followed by repetition, audiences begin to connect the dots. In recent months, commentary surrounding Meghan and Harry has increasingly focused on media strategy itself. Observers question whether continued visibility reflects organic relevance or deliberate maintenance. The difference matters. Audiences respond very differently to attention that feels earned versus attention that feels managed. When relevance feels organic, curiosity follows. When it feels engineered, skepticism grows. That skepticism has been intensified by the tone of certain responses. Statements framed as lighthearted or dismissive suggesting critics should not take optics too seriously may be intended to diffuse tension, but for audiences who interpret symbolism differently, such messaging can feel misaligned with deeply held values. Public figures are not required to satisfy every perspective. However, when messaging consistently underestimates audience sensitivity, trust erodes quietly, without protest. Meanwhile, Prince Harry's ongoing legal proceedings introduce a strikingly different tone into the public narrative. Inside the courtroom, the polished framing scene elsewhere gives way to something less controlled. His testimony has been described as emotionally charged, at times requiring judicial intervention to redirect focus toward factual clarity. These moments stand out precisely because they lack narrative smoothing. For viewers, the contrast is difficult to ignore. On-screen vulnerability often appears carefully constructed. In court, emotion surfaces unevenly, without the benefit of editing or framing. The difference invites comparison, raising questions about where emotion is curated and where it emerges unfiltered. This does not invalidate the experiences being described, but it does influence how they are received. In modern storytelling, authenticity is judged not only by truth, but by texture. Audiences look for hesitation, complexity, and unresolved tension. When narratives arrive fully formed, with conclusions already embedded, they leave little room for connection. The shift reflects a broader evolution in how audiences engage with celebrity narratives. Viewers are increasingly resistant to being told how to feel. They prefer interpretation over instruction, discovery over direction. When emotional beats become predictable, engagement declines. Importantly, this decline rarely announces itself. It appears subtly in slower response times, reduced urgency, and quieter coverage. Projects continue to exist, but they no longer feel essential. Everything remains courteous. Nothing feels urgent. In a media ecosystem driven by momentum, that subtle change is decisive. What replaces emotional investment is observational interest. Audiences continue to watch, not because they feel personally involved, but because they recognize a process unfolding. The gradual transition from influence to maintenance, from narrative leadership to reaction. This is not unique to Meghan and Harry. It is a broader phenomenon seen across entertainment, politics, and digital culture. Influence does not vanish when opposition succeeds. It fades when attention reorganizes elsewhere. At that stage, narratives no longer lead. They respond. The most revealing signals are rarely dramatic. They are quiet shifts, explanations that feel excessive, appearances that generate discussion but not excitement, visibility that remains high while impact diminishes. This is where the current story appears to be positioned, not on the brink of collapse, but at a crossroads between relevance and routine. The takeaway is not about assigning blame. It is about alignment. When storytelling aligns with lived complexity, connection forms naturally. When it feels overly managed, audiences disengage without hostility. And once that disengagement sets in, control over the narrative subtly changes hands. The story continues, but it is no longer directed from the center. It is interpreted from the outside by observers who are analytical, detached, and increasingly independent in how they assign meaning. That is the space where modern public narratives now exist, between intention and reception, between visibility and influence. And it is there, in that quiet space, that the next chapter will be shaped not by statements or strategies, but by whether attention returns organically or continues its slow drift elsewhere.